In March and April, we took a long-awaited belated honeymoon to New Zealand and Australia. Tonight we'll be talking about the beauties and wonders of New Zealand and how we live the ECP motto, "We do it all." After years of planning and about a day of flying, we arrived in Auckland, New Zealand. The flight to Queenstown was short comparatively.
3 years now, Alaska living, score a ticket to New Zealand. Don't know what I'll be seeing down in Queenstown, down in Queenstown.
When we flew into the Queenstown airport, I wasn't sure where Denise had us going. Not quite a dirt runway, but windsocks out in open fields made me wonder if civilization of any kind existed out here. Queenstown quickly dashed my thoughts that we were left in the hands of a lonely sheep farmer who watched Deliverance one too many times. Historically, Queenstown was visited by the indigenous Maori for its greenstone, aka jade. Then the Europeans came for the grazing pastures and discovered gold in the Shotover River, which became the highest gold-producing river in the world per kilometer. Today, Queenstown is known as the adventure capital of the world. It is often described as the world's most stunning and natural scenic playground. We thought this was a fitting place for us to begin our adventure.
Like all wonderful experiences, the trip to Doubtful Sound was a process, not an event. From Queenstown, we traveled with Real Journeys and had a great trip through Fiordland to Doubtful Sound. Our bus driver was a wealth of information. We talked about rugby, healthcare, and families in New Zealand. Our journey gave us the opportunity to travel on the Kingston Flyer, a vintage steam train where you can sit back, listen to 1920s music, and enjoy the scenery. After an hour and a half, the train reunited with the bus, and after a total of 4 hours of travel through Fiordland, we were at Lake Manapori.
Now, we board the Fiordland Flyer for an hour-long boat ride to the western arm of New Zealand's most beautiful lake, with its irregular shoreline, 250 islands, and steep, snow-capped mountains. It has truly earned the description, the loveliest lake in New Zealand. On this lake is New Zealand's largest hydroelectric power plant. Its 7 massive turbines are actually hidden over a mile underground within an enormous granite-walled cavern inside the mountain. After a quick tour of the power plant's visitor center, we continue to Doubtful Sound.
We went by bus along one of New Zealand's most remote roads, the Beaumont Pass. The mountains we crossed into Doubtful Sound were a remarkable temperate rainforest. With less than an inch of soil, the dense beech forest interlocks its roots to collect leaf mold for their nutrients. And because lack of nutrients wasn't enough challenge for the forest, there are over 1,000 earthquakes each year. Landslides occur quite often as rain-soaked old growth tears away from the granite base and new moss comes in to fill its place. Then we came over the Wilmot Pass and were face to face with Doubtful Sound at the lofty lookout. From this height we gazed in awe at the depth and expanse of the fjord. It was 25 miles in length and over 1,300 foot at its deepest point.
Doubtful Sound is the second largest of the 14 fjords in Fiordland National Park. It's a remarkable part of New Zealand where the deep, deep ocean meets the towering peaks and sheltered coves to form a stunning landscape. A mere 2 million years ago, ice ages developed as the Earth's climate cooled. Snow turned to ice. In valleys like this one, glaciers ground their way towards the sea. Warm periods were interspersed with cold, so that the glaciers retreated and advanced many times, each time sculpting more of the landscape.
We boarded the Fiordland Navigator. We quickly unpacked and went topside where the weather was beautiful and sunny. We traveled the length of the sound to the neat islets on the edge of the Tasman Sea. There, a colony of 75 to 100 New Zealand fur seals spread over the rocky outcroppings. Life is abundant and protected here, always on the edge of 2 separate but connected marine worlds where the turbulent Tasman Sea meets tranquil Doubtful Sound. Then, on our way to the kayaking spot, a pod of bottlenose dolphins performed for us. Among the largest and most southern known, there are about 60 bottlenose dolphins living in Doubtful Sound.
The first spot that we stopped in to go kayaking proved to be too windy, so we moved to another cove. The kayaking was great. If we felt small on the Fiordland Navigator, You can just imagine what we felt like in the kayaks. No real wildlife to speak of, but a serene peace balanced by a much missed activity. It was great to finally be doing something active after a long winter of sloth and laziness, not to mention all that time on a plane. Then, a magnificent dinner and an informative slideshow ended the day. Wow, what a first day. Welcome to New Zealand.
Throughout Monday, the crew talked about how disappointed they were with the weather. They claimed that without the rain, the waterfalls weren't as spectacular. So when we awoke in the morning and found that the weather had changed, we weren't disappointed. With over 200 inches and over 200 days of rainfall per year, it is what makes Fiordland a land of lakes, rivers, streams, waterfalls, and fjords. In fact, many say you have not seen Fiordland unless you've seen it in the rain. When it rains, the landscape becomes even more dramatic. Rock faces stream with waterfalls, mist hangs around the tops of mountains, and rivers and streams rage. From the dry, comfortable vantage point on board the boat, this landscape was spectacular.
Then we went to Hall Arm to experience the silence of the sound. The captain turned off the engines and all human sound ceased. The splash of tumbling water was amplified by the natural acoustics of the still water and high granite cliffs. The last stop before returning to Deep Cove is the fabled Lady Alice Falls. What a great beginning to our 5-week adventure.
By 12:30, we were in Te Anau. Known as the sightseeing and walking capital of the world, this was a town we just had to see. So we checked in, again, great accommodations, showered, and walked into town. Our first sight was the beautiful Lake Te Anau. Created by the same glaciers that created Doubtful Sound, it's the largest lake in the South Island of New Zealand. The first order of business was lunch. Then we explored the town. We found a grocery store, then checked out the visitor center. It had great pictures, displays, and exhibits, as well as information about the treks. By the time we got back to our room, we decided that lunch had filled us up and bed sounded more appealing.
Wednesday morning, got up, had brekkie, and met our guide Dave for our one-day hike on the Milford Track. At this historic stockman's hut, which dates back to the 1890s, we were surprised to see that the windows didn't overlook that spectacular view. Then we took a great boat ride across the headwaters of Lake Te Anau to the Milford Track trailhead. Many trekkers also made the trip with us. Each year, about 14,000 people complete the Milford Track. 34 miles in length, it's known as the finest walk in the world. It winds its way through some of the most picturesque yet roughest landscapes, including lakes, rivers, waterfalls, rainforest, beech forest, and alpine meadows. We were really bummed that our time didn't allow us to do the whole trek.
Our guide set a good pace for the hike. We stopped for lunch next to the Gladeburn stream. Dave was very interesting and talked a lot about the different fauna and flora, as well as the history of the track. For example, we crossed along Suspension Bridge, which was built by the Fiji Army so they could use the track for training. Then through a tall beech forest we moved. The plants began to shrink and change. And finally we emerged into full sunlight and entered the wetlands. After a quick walk around the boardwalk, we continued on to the shelter. The shelters have helicopters which bring in supplies about once a week. Then we turned around and headed back to the boat to return to Te Anau.
Denise made a friend, Steve, while cooking in the hostel's kitchen. She had introduced herself from Pittsburgh, PA, and Steve became very interested. He was from Australia, and even in the land of rugby, the Pittsburgh Steelers were known. Steve was a huge Steelers fan, and wanted to barter for the Super Bowl shirt I just happened to be wearing. I was feeling a good buzz and decided to go for the barter. Shirt for shirt, pose for picture, and answer that million-dollar question, what were the 2 buttons on the toilets for? We then went to the wildlife park. This was a great walk and a great place to see some of Fiordland's most rare and fascinating birds, including the once thought to be extinct takahe.
We woke up early the next morning to experience the Milford Road and Milford Sound. Kayaking was the adventure of the day, and the Milford Road was the adventure within the adventure. The outstanding scenery began in the Eglinton Valley. Streaked with waterfalls, the snow-capped mountains loomed over 3,000 feet above the road. Their magnificence was reflected in the Mirror Lakes. We stopped for cocoa and admired a great view of the reflected Earl Mountains. The road then climbed steeply into an alpine wonderland at the Homer Tunnel entrance. We emerged from the tunnel to an instantly breathtaking view of the canyon which descended into Milford Sound.
Our guide for the day was Sam. We all had two-person kayaks, and Denise and I got along amazingly well. We'd enjoyed talking to people from around the world on our adventures, and we were disappointed when the whole group was American. The scenic icon of New Zealand is the picture-perfect view of Mitre Peak, mirrored in the glassy waters of Milford Sound. Standing at over 5,500 feet, this is one of the highest mountains in the world that rise directly from the ocean floor. No wonder it has been described as the eighth wonder of the world and the most stirring sight in the Pacific.
The weather remained rainy, cold, and overcast for most of the day. And with rain comes waterfalls. This one was Bowen Falls, or more correctly, Lady Bowen Falls, after the wife of one of New Zealand's early governors. These falls leap in 2 steps from a high glacial hanging valley over 500 foot above the sound. The kayaking was easy and beautiful, but Sam still thought we were working too hard, so we took it a little easier and set up sail. It certainly was not a difficult day of paddling, but it was beautiful.
The trip back along the Milford Road was a unique journey in and of itself. We went through the Homer Tunnel, a completely hand-carved tunnel 3/4 of a mile long, carved through the very center of New Zealand's magnificent mountain ranges. We stopped at Great Waterfalls and had afternoon tea in the Eglinton Valley, also known as the Avenue of the Disappearing Mountain. We got back to Te Anau earlier than expected and decided to walk through the wildlife park again. After that, we went back to our room, met up with Steve, and had dinner and drinks at the Moose. Then back to the lodge for another early night to bed.
We got up early the next morning, packed our bags, and prepped for the next part of our adventure. We were anxious to get out into the woods without a guide and just enjoy the sights with each other. The Rupern Track was named as one of the top 10 hikes in the world by National Geographic Adventure magazine. It traverses wild and scenic mountain country between 2 major valley systems at the base of New Zealand's Southern Alps. It connects 2 of New Zealand's jewels, Mount Aspiring and Fiordland National Parks, and includes the stunning scenery from The Lord of the Rings.
We started our 3-day hike at the Divide in Fiordland National Park. Surrounded by eerie-looking wispy goblin moss, we wound our way through the dense beech forest along a well-graded trail. After about an hour and an almost 1,000-foot climb, we reached Treeline and the magnificent views opened up over Hollyford Valley. We dropped our packs, kept cameras in hand, and climbed up the 3,000-foot Key Summit for the spectacular views which now included the Greenstone Valley. Jagged snow-capped peaks rose majestically. The weather was partly cloudy and warm, much different than the snow that others had experienced less than a week before.
Key Summit and peaks of Mount Aspiring National Park surround an open meadow set high on a rare triple continental divide. From there, 3 major valleys carry 3 major rivers to 3 different coasts. 250 million years ago, we would have been standing under the sea. Fiordland lies next to a dramatic fracture in the boundary between 2 plates making up the Earth's crust. The Indo-Australian plate has plunged beneath the Pacific plate, causing the land on the Pacific plate to be heaved up to form the Southern Alps, the mountain backbone of the South Island. Now we stand over 2,500 feet above the sea and enjoy the spectacular view.
After descending Key Summit, we collected our packs and headed to Lake Howden for a quick lunch. Then we continued a gradual ascent through beech forests, crossing many waterfalls and bridges along the way to the magnificent Erland Falls. This 570-foot high waterfall was right next to the trail, and we got drenched by the mist as we hiked by. We were blown away by the views in all directions. Then we continued, descending to our reserved hut at Lake Mackenzie. We both agreed that the day hike on Milford Track was a good thing to do to prep us for this hike. We got into the hut around 5:30. Denise grabbed us a double bunk, and I went to Lake Mackenzie to filter water. We had our backpacker's meal for dinner, and then headed for bed. We put in earplugs to block the sound of 38 other sleeping backpackers and one cranky infant, and drifted off to sleep.
Breakfast consisted of coffee and couscous porridge. We waited for most of the people to clear out before we got our stuff together and headed up the steep and switchback climb to the alpine section of the trail. The weather was overcast, and the forecast posted by the ranger in the morning promised rain turning to showers. We threw on all our warm clothes and rain gear. The higher we climbed, the more the wind swirled around us. We mostly saw thick clouds, effectively blocking any views of the fjord peaks we knew were there. We reached the Harris Saddle day shelter, but again were robbed of any views due to cloud cover. We had a quick lunch of granola bars and continued along the trek. We passed Lake Harris and then entered into an immense alpine basin. We noticed that the stones along the trail turned to a deep shade of green in the rain. There were also many purple stones, the color of an eggplant. We got to the shelter earlier than we thought we would. Wet clothes were hanging everywhere to dry. We quickly claimed 2 bunks, then started dinner. After dinner, we played chess while others played cards or read. Again, another early night.
The next morning, we had our second round of couscous porridge and headed out on a trail that was considerably drier, warmer, and sunnier than the day before. We took a quick hike back towards the Harris Day shelter to see what we had missed because of the rain. The bus was picking us up at 2 o'clock though, so we didn't have as much time as we would have liked to re-explore. We descended about 1,000 feet to the alpine meadows of Rootburn Flats through more beech forest. Crossing the grassy river flats, we wound alongside the deep green pools of the Rootburn River. The hike was along a roaring stream through most of the trail. We used swing bridges crossing a couple of the creeks. Crossing a large landslide area, we had the most wonderful views down to the river and across the valley to snow-capped peaks. The third day was by far the easiest hiking we had done. We got to the pickup spot about 45 minutes early, boarded the bus, and headed back into Queenstown.
We checked back into the YHA and retrieved our bags from storage. After long hot showers, we headed into town to eat at a brew pub. After dinner, we stopped at a convenience store and picked up a 6-pack of beer as well as honey and crumpets for breakfast. We walked back to the YHA and did laundry. 1 week down, 4 more to go. Monday morning we packed our stuff up, emailed an update to friends and family, and headed into town to buy souvenirs. We took the gondola up to the top of Queenstown for some amazing views. While up there, I convinced Paul to do the luge ride. He ended up having a blast, even though he crashed a couple times. Then we were off to the Bay of Islands for some sailing and scuba diving.
We flew out of Queenstown, had a layover in Auckland, and finally boarded the plane for the Bay of Islands. Denise was positively giddy when she saw my expression at our mode of transportation. It was a twin-prop plane that held a total of 16 passengers. The co-pilot was also our flight attendant. We made it to our bed and breakfast in Tutukaka by about 9:30 that evening. After a cup of tea and a quick chat with our hostess, Mary, we retired for the evening.
The next morning, Mary prepared breakfast for us and we went to the dive shop. Scuba was the day's adventure and Poor Knights Island was the destination.
The Poor Knights Islands were inhabited for many generations by a population of 300 to 400 Maori. In the early 1800s, while the tribe's chief and warriors were away fighting, their tribe was attacked and wiped out by another tribe. Upon their return, they were met by 10 survivors who told of what happened. They performed what last rites they could, declared the islands to be strictly forbidden as a burial ground, and moved to new islands to live. The Poor Knights Islands got their name when Captain Cook discovered them. The 2 islands lying like recumbent effigies of crusaders, heads to the south, feet thrust towards the warm northern sun, these Captain Cook named the Poor Knights.
Separated from mainland New Zealand, the Poor Knights Islands are influenced by a warm current from the Coral Sea north of Australia. With a higher water temperature, about 70 degrees, came greater visibility and more life than in the nearby coastal waters. Named by Jacques Cousteau as one of the top 10 dive sites in the world, It has underwater caves, tunnels, and archways that are home to an extraordinary variety of seaweeds and friendly, colorful fish. The result is a truly unique underwater environment. The first dive was Ocalina Point. Being a bit of a refresher, paired with the deepest dive to start the 2 days, about 90 feet, we burned through air pretty quickly. But we did see great coral, lots of cool fish, and lots of kelp and algae. Between dives, we went into the Rico Rico Cave, the largest sea cave in the world. We docked inside and learned a bit about it. 10 million years ago, the volcano that created these islands had an eruption which formed a giant gas bubble that became this cave. Renowned for its amazing acoustics, many performances have been held.
The second dive was at Sugarloaf, the single pinnacle of the islands. Featuring Stingray Alley at 70 feet, this dive site had a lot to offer. Stingrays were everywhere. Tiny blue light bulb fish were in the shallower waters, eels in crevices, and more kelp and algae forests surrounded us. Denise observed that unlike diving in the US, these dive masters weren't rushing us off the boat and into the water, and there was always more than enough time to do your whole dive. I thought it really gave a great example of the difference in lifestyles. The Kiwis were definitely more relaxed and calm than the Americans. We headed back to the B&B, showered, and went into Whangarei for dinner.
The next morning, we had another lovely breakfast, then headed back to the dive shop. We got on a different boat this time, the Calypso. The first dive site was the Gentle Forest. It was much longer and more relaxed dive, thanks to the shallower depth, only about 50 feet, and our increased comfort zone. We saw many fish, more kelp forest, and lots of urchins. Our second dive went well also. It was at Trevor's Rock in the Gardens, again about 50 feet. Although it seemed like we were back in the same spot, the captain assured us we were not. We did see a lot of the same things, but it was different enough to keep us interested. When we returned to the B&B, we showered and then went to Tutankhamun for dinner.
Because we couldn't fly right after diving, we went sailing. We got to the Bay of Islands earlier than we expected, so we stopped to see the Waitangi National Trust Treaty Grounds. The Treaty of Waitangi was signed in 1840 between the Maori chiefs and the British Crown, and it became the basis for life in New Zealand today. After a quick stop at the visitor center, we went to the dock to begin our day of sailing. The sailing was great. We even got to help out. We sailed out to one of the many islands where we disembarked and took a short walk up to a great view. The grass was so soft that we didn't even need shoes. Then back to the boat where we got our snorkel gear together and did a short bit of snorkeling. Much different than Poor Knights Island. The water was much colder and there wasn't nearly as much to see. Once back on the boat, though, we saw plenty in the water. The best were the dolphins. We had a pod of bottlenose dolphins that played with us throughout the trip. The weather held out for the most part, and we had a really great day. We flew out of the tiny Bay of Islands airport in a plane just a bit larger than the one we flew up on. Back to Auckland, then on to Rotorua. After getting our car, we drove to the Rotorua Thermal Holiday Park. We checked into our cabin and ventured into town for a delicious meal. We did notice the town smelled a bit like sulfur on the drive back, but it wasn't overpowering.
We headed to Tepui for the day. Tepui was a Maori village that had many different features. We went on the guided tour that explained a lot about the Maori culture and history. Our guide was one of the ancestors of the original tribe and was very proud of her heritage. The tour started in the New Zealand Maori Arts and Crafts Institute. For 38 years, students from tribes across New Zealand converged to learn the native traditions before they were lost forever. The arts and crafts were the pages of the Maori culture. Then we watched the Maori cultural performances, the kapahaka, where stories of old soar to life again through song. Poi and stick games reveal how their favorite pastimes were really training for agility and coordination. Next was a train tour around the Wakarewawa Thermal Valley. For the local Maori, this valley was more than a natural wonder. It was the place where the goddesses of fire, Te Pupu and Te Whara, emerged from the Earth's core, inhaling and exhaling, creating the geysers, hot springs, and mud pools. The train let us off in the middle of the thermal valley so we could walk back and experience the area in a more natural way. On the way back to the main area, we stopped at the Kiwi house only to find that the Kiwis had been moved because of the loud construction nearby. From there we walked through a replica village and ended back at the visitor center. I bought a tribal mask to add to our growing collection of masks from around the world.
Once we had our fill of tepui, we headed to the gondola, a 3,000-foot-long cableway system with a vertical rise of 585 feet. It took us up the side of Mount Gangatha. Again, the reward was wonderful views of the town. We bought 2 luge runs this time because we were really enjoying it, and this luge claimed to be the original. We did 1 trip down the scenic route, then 1 down the fast route. We had a wonderful time all around. Then we went back into town and had dinner before going back to our cabin. The thermal park included complimentary hot thermal pools, so we soaked up for a bit before going to bed.
Saturday morning, we visited the buried village. We learned the history of the pink and white terraces and the surrounding community of Tawarua that was destroyed in 1886 when Mount Tarawera erupted. We learned that there were warnings of the impending disaster, including earthquakes, increased thermal activity, a surge on the lake, and the appearance of a phantom war canoe. The eruption buried 3 villages and claimed the lives of 150 people. This was the only one of the villages that has been excavated. The nature walk around the village ended with a spectacular Wiri Falls. The waterfall system included 3 main waterfalls, the highest being 90 feet. Then we were off to Hell's Gate Geothermal Reserve.
New Zealand is located on the Ring of Fire, where the Earth's crust is very thin and is always in a state of upheaval. Rotorua lies on New Zealand's volcanic plateau, where geothermal activity is pronounced. Hell's Gate is set in 50 acres with a large variety of geothermal features. We walk past steaming fumaroles and pools of boiling mud, so violent they are unnerving. The path followed the footsteps of ancient warriors through the swirling clouds of steam, past the pool where the Maori princess Ruatini lost her life by the violent geothermal activity of the Inferno, and the Kakaki Falls, the largest hot waterfall in the southern hemisphere. Here, warriors would bathe in the sulfurous waters to heal their wounds after battle and remove the tapu, sacredness, of war. After a walk through the reserve, we considered a mud bath, but time was not on our side. We had a hanging to get to, and that was not to be missed.
The Tamaki Maori village was our gateway to the world of ancient Maori and proud warriors. We took a journey back in time to a pre-European lifestyle and experienced the customs and traditions of the ancient Maori. The trip to the village was very entertaining. Our tour driver Mark explained what kia ora meant in every language imaginable, quite impressively using the native tongue of each language. His love of rugby was as great as that of most other Kiwis, and he used that as his qualifications for picking our bus's chief, who served as the emissary for the Maori. We were greeted in typical Maori fashion. When we entered, we were treated to a pre-European village, alive with the sound and activities of tribal songs, dances, myths, and legends. And then the hangi, which was a feast of Maori food. Various types of meats and vegetables were wrapped in leaves and placed in a hole in the ground and cooked with hot stones. And then some more entertainment.
Sunday morning, we packed up and left in a rainy mist to drive 2.5 hours to the Waitoma glowworm caves. The Waitoma glowworm is unique to New Zealand. The glows are used to attract other insects, which they capture with sticky strands suspended from the ceiling. We did a 30-minute walking tour of the glowworm caves, then finished with a 15-minute boat tour through the glowworm grotto. And that ended our adventure in New Zealand. 2 weeks down, 3 weeks to go.